Hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this much anticipated episode of MASA TV. I'm all dressed up today for this very special collaboration with Impetus Consulting Group, and if you don't know who they are a pro bono consulting organization that gives students the opportunity to work with real life clients on business problems. And Sai, who is the managing director of Impetus, will be coming in and talking a lot more about what it's like being at Impetus and what you'll be doing as a project consultant. In addition to Sai, Daniel, who is the director of consulting, will also go through what's expected at the assessment center and go about how you should be answering market sizing questions. Impetus has given our viewers today a very amazing offer as well. If you're tuning in live and you've applied to Impetus or you're planning to apply, please fill in the feedback form at the end of this episode. What will happen is, because you've shown an interest and motivation for consulting, that will be considered during your application as your name will be highlighted. So today we're also going to have an interview with Hung Deng, who is an associate at Boston Consulting Group, about what it's like to work in consulting, followed by Impetus's managing director and director of consulting, and lastly a short segment about what it's like, how you can be more involved in consulting as a student. Now, I've got to warn you, in my interview with Hung, my face looks like it has a lot of makeup and that I'm wearing red lipstick, but I'm just going to blame the camera and video settings for that. So please keep that in mind. Putting that aside, Hung has some great advice and words of wisdom for you today. So I recommend you listen very carefully to what she has to say. Hi, Hung. Thank you so much for joining us today. For the viewers who don't know, could you please introduce yourself and what you do?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jimmy. Well, my name's Hung and I'm currently an associate at BCG. I'm really excited to be here with you all today, albeit virtually. I've been around at BCG for a little bit more than 1.5 years, and most of my work has been in the banking and financial institutions industry, which is super exciting because there's a lot of change happening there. Back in my uni days, I studied commerce, majoring in accounting and finance at Monash. And I graduated in 2018. And a bit of a fun fact, in 2017, I was actually the vice pres of MASA. So it's doubly exciting to be back talking to you all.
Yeah, amazing. So you're currently a consultant at BCG, and we're wondering, what is your take on what a consultant is and what do consultants do at BCG?
Great question. And it's one that I honestly get asked a lot. And you'll find that a lot of consultants really struggle to define what their job is because it is just that varied. But if I had to break down what exactly management consulting is, if we focus on the actual words, so management, meaning that we're typically working with middle management in large corporations. So think of like your ASX listed top 100, 200 companies. We're working with the CEO or a couple levels under them. So we're working on problems which keep them up at night, which are really quite huge and impactful and will impact their business for several years ongoing. And when we think about the word consulting, well, essentially that's just providing advice and recommendations on those issues and providing like an independent view that their business otherwise might not be able to have. And so consultant, my role at BCG, is not exactly to solve all their problems in a vacuum, but we work in teams with other BCGers from all sorts of different backgrounds and with the client as well to solve those problems together, to figure out what exactly is going wrong or how to capture certain opportunities and help them forward.
Yeah, thank you. I think that clarifies a lot. But I still think a lot of viewers would be curious as to what your day-to-day life as a consultant would be. Like, for example, do you work on Excel a lot? Do you do a lot of research? Do you go to the client site, slide making, things like that? Would you be able to elaborate on those things?
Absolutely. So when I think about my day-to-day and what I actually do, it really varies depending on project to project, and you'll hear that a lot, and it is such a frustrating answer, but it's very true. But if I had to try and describe some of the tasks that we do, let's say a typical week, if I'm on a project case, then typically what happens Monday to Thursday, I'll be at the client site. So you actually co-locate and sit next to them. And on Friday is where you come back to the actual BCG office and participate in some affiliation activities. And within Monday to Thursday, some of the tasks that you might be responsible for as an associate or consultant would be undertaking analysis. For example, we might get some client data and do some quantitative analysis on Excel or some more cool tools like Tableau and Alteryx, which are now in the happening. You might also be helping to craft the overall story that we're trying to paint with the client about their situation, the question you're trying to answer, some of the analyses, and then the recommendations that we're also putting forward. So there's a lot of slide making. PowerPoint and Excel are basically our jam. And there's also a lot of meetings. So a lot of stakeholder engagement, trying to discuss and communicate and brainstorm different ideas that we have with various clients and also within our internal teams as well. So it's a mixture of those activities.
Awesome. That sounds great. And touching on some of the, I guess, the project work that you do, what are some of the most interesting projects that you've personally worked on?
Yeah, for sure. When I think about super interesting projects for me, they're typically projects that are quite what we call customer-centric, so ones that really put customer at the forefront of things. So two that come to mind are one a couple months back where I was working on what we call redesigning the customer experience for the banking distribution channels, which in layman terms is just talking about when you go to a bank branch or when you interact with a bank via your mobile or when you call the contact center, how can we make that experience for customers as awesome as possible? So there was a lot of creativity and problem solving trying to figure out what was causing poor customer experience in different aspects and how I could redesign that for the future state. So that was super awesome. And then another cool project I was working on was helping a non-banking client figure out how they could launch a financial product and basically disrupt the whole banking industry as we know it. So it was more of like a startup hacky tech type of project, which I found super awesome. I had the opportunity to work with a bunch of people in a multidisciplinary team. So we had IT gurus and customer experience and user experience guys, marketing people, all in the one room, creating this super awesome product. So those are two that come to mind.
That sounds really cool. And I think we have a much better understanding of what consulting is and what you do in consulting. So I guess we'll move on to a few like more personal questions. For example, did you know that you always wanted to go into consulting? And if so, or if not, like, why did you pick consulting in the end?
Yeah, absolutely not. I did not know I was going into consulting. And a lot of consultants that you speak to will say the exact same thing, that we all kind of just stumbled upon this career path because it's not one that's really advertised and out there for a lot of people. But for me, for most of my uni years, coming from an accounting finance degree, like a lot of you guys, I thought I was just going to walk down the typical accounting route. I was going to, do well in my studies. I was going to do some internships, which I did. I actually interned at KPMG in their internal audit function. I was going to secure the grad role, work there for a couple of years, get my CA, get out, move to industry, and who knows, slowly climb the ranks there. Very stable, very clear trajectory. But I think it was towards the last couple of months of my uni degree where I began to think a bit more broadly about my career options. And that was also when we were learning about things to do with disruption in industry and the sorts of soft skills that you need. The fact that it's very possible that auditing as an industry might not even exist in 10, 20 years because it's overtaken by the robots. And my experience at KPMG also taught me what I enjoyed and didn't really enjoy in a job. And I found that really monotonous, routine checking type of tasks weren't really what I was interested in. I wanted something more challenging, more rigorous, that was going to give me the opportunity to understand the business as a whole and help solve problems that were going to be super impactful. I had some experience at a pro bono consultancy, GCG, and I found the experience there to give me a bit of insight into what consulting was like. And I thought, you know what, if I could give my shot at doing something like this for a couple of years, that would be pretty awesome. So that's basically how I stumbled into consulting. I sort of just decided accounting wasn't for me and chucked my hat in the ring, and here we are.
Yeah, that's great. So you also mentioned in the beginning that you're actually the VP of MASA, Vice President of MASA, which is really cool because you're featuring on MASA TV now. And you've had some internship experience and stuff like that. So we're wondering, how did MASA and your other uni extracurricular activities help with your career development, getting those internships, getting a job at BCG, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So critical and not something to be underrated. I think in particular, my experience at MASA, especially when I was VP, taught me just so many invaluable skills that I think for a lot of us just sound like buzzwords. So when you think about things like communication skills, leadership skills, problem solving, negotiation, all of these skills, which sound like buzzwords, are actually things that we use day to day. They're also the things by which we get measured on at work in our performance reviews. So they're actually quite critical. And being in different situations at MASA and different extracurriculars really taught me how to manage different scenarios. For example, when a sponsor's not happy with you, what do you do? When people aren't coming to your events, what do you do? When you're trying to motivate a team of 20-something people to share the same vision as you, what do you do? How do you position yourself when you give speeches to an entire AGM audience or to your MASA team? It's quite daunting. And I think these sorts of experiences really prepare you well, not just for your internship applications when you can draw on examples, but just when you're in the workplace, knowing that you've faced those situations before in your extracurriculars just preps you so well for it.
Awesome, because I think a lot of us who are watching MASA TV are also doing a lot of extracurriculars, so that's good to hear. In terms of recruiting and interviewing, do you have any tips and advice for students wanting to, for example, get into consulting, BCG, stuff like case interviews or just interviews in general? Yeah, for sure. So things that come to mind, of course, it's good to be on top of your uni grades and your extracurriculars and beefing out your resume, which I'm sure most people would be keen on doing. But I think something that's a bit underrated, which I would advise, is this is a tip which I personally use to stand out a bit during the interview process, which I think will help many of you, is to be really crisp and clear on your why, or essentially what is your purpose in life, which sounds very deep and philosophical and meaningful, but it's basically just talking about what is the impact that you would like to see from your work that you do, or what would you like to be known for, and being really crisp and clear on that why and linking that to how a job at the place that you're applying to could facilitate that is just so powerful, because it shows the recruiters or the partners that you're interviewing with that you're a very passionate and purposeful person, that you're obviously intellectually curious, and you understand that this job is a give and take situation, that you want experience from it, but you're also giving something back. And I think that's just an incredible thing to show any company, and they'd be super willing to take anyone like that on. And then the second tip that I would have specific to consulting is around the case interview process, which can be quite daunting for a lot of people. But my tips around that would be to try not to over-rely or memorize a whole ton of different consulting frameworks, which a lot of people tend to do. I think when you do a case interview, which is essentially when they ask you how you would solve a business problem, what they're really trying to get an insight into is how you structure and break a problem down. And you don't need fancy frameworks to do that. It's purely just how you categorize and segment different things and then tackle each one by one. So those are the two tips I'd give. Awesome. I think that was some really great advice. And then I guess for our last question to finish it off, do you have any final words for our MASA TV audience? Anything you want to say?
Awesome. So if I had a couple of pearls of wisdom to share, it would be this. So I would really strongly urge you to think a bit more broadly about your career path than just what is typically advertised and marketed to you. I think a lot of accounting firms are so on point with their marketing that you'll know about them straight away from when you first step foot into university campus, if not earlier. But as accounting grads or commerce grads in general, we just have so much to offer all sorts of different companies. So I would urge you to also consider a path in consulting, because the skills that you need in accounting are also skills that you would need in consulting. And if you're interested in a really diverse, challenging career that will provide you a lot of growth, then I personally think consulting is a fantastic career to think about. Another thing that I would advise is to, on the point about growth, is to prioritize that over stability, which I think for a lot of accounting students and grads is an easy trap to fall into. We want the clear unambiguous and easier path to walk down, but it's not necessarily the one that will benefit us long term. So to that end, I would challenge you to think not only about the next 4 to 5 years and where you'd like to be, but to think really longer term in the next 10 to 20 years where we'll be managers, say, in this new workplace, the type of world that might be and what sort of impact you would want to make. And then the third point that I would advise you guys to do is to make the most out of your time at university and to get as involved as you can be. I just don't think I would have gotten to where I am today if not for the extracurriculars I was part of, if not for my MASA experience, if not for all those things that helped build my character personally and professionally. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd like to thank you so much for your time today. We know working at BCG can be very busy, but you've given us 10 minutes of your time for this interview today, and I'm sure you've helped a lot of aspiring consultants and students as well. So thank you, Han.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi everyone and welcome back. We're so excited to have Sai, the Managing Director of Impetus Consulting Group, with us today. Sai, it seems like you're wearing an Impetus t-shirt. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's Impetus exclusive, actually. So
you got to join Impetus to get one. Is that right?
Of course.
Oh, I wish I had one. But let's get into the beef of today's episode. Sai, could you please give us an introduction as to who you are and what your relationship to Impetus is?
Yeah, for sure. So, hi everyone. My name is Sai, like Jimmy mentioned. I'm a third-year Commerce and IT student at Monash University. I joined Impetus in my first semester at uni in 2018. I joined because my brother pushed me back then. He was part of Impetus quite a while ago, and fortunately I was lucky enough to secure a position as a project consultant in that semester. I then moved into a project manager role the following semester, and then into the consulting portfolio as the assistant director of consulting, and fortunately enough to be managing director this year at Impetus.
Wow, that's amazing that you're the managing director now. But you did start off as a project consultant, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
So we're wondering, what does a typical project entail at Impetus Consulting Group, especially as, like, I guess, a project consultant?
Yeah, for sure. So our semester will begin with our client engagement team looking to work with new clients or re-engage with some of our older clients. Once this is done, we look to allocate our team to each of the projects. Through industry research, best practices, and some of our own experience, what we've done is created a Impetus project method, which looks at 4 key steps to achieve a successful project. The first step looks at defining. It's structuring the problem, framing it, and breaking down the overarching issue into some of its constituent components. This is followed by our investigating phase. We look to create a plan to find some suitable solutions. How we're going to go about doing all this will be answered during this phase. Research and analysis will also begin during this time. This is followed by the create phase, where we want to create a narrative to articulate some of our findings to the client. At this point, we're close to, if not finished our research, and we'd like to refine the data that we've collected and establish how we'd like to present some of our findings. Lastly, we have our presenting phase, where we look to find how we're going to present to our client, whether that's going to be a presentation or a report itself. This is a phase where we look to assess how the project has gone so far and look to gain some feedback from the client.
Yeah, sounds good. So it seems like a lot of the project has to do with problem solving.
Yeah.
So at Impetus, how exactly do you go about solving the problem?
Yeah, so how we've broken it down is into 7 key steps. They may vary based on each of the projects or even organizations themselves. But what we look to do is 7 key steps, which look at defining the problem, examining all potential causes for the problem, identifying viable alternatives to resolve the problem, and selecting an alternative. So these 4 key steps is what we'll be looking into for the next couple of slides, and steps 5, 6, and 7 will be looked into further in the presentation themselves. So how we go about structuring a problem and breaking it down into its constituent components is through an issue tree. So an issue tree is a graphical breakdown of a problem that breaks a overarching problem into multiple sections and progresses from detail from left to right. Issue trees are extremely helpful for a few reasons. One, they enable consultants to break down complex problems into simple ones. They allow consultants to focus on the subsections that are logically connected to the overarching problem. And so when consultants work on specific sections, they can understand what will contribute to that overall problem. Without the issue tree, it's very easy to get lost in the details, to lose track of whether a solution will solve the overall problem. And finally, they're a great communication tool. So it's very easy to understand which section is looking at the overarching problem. So within your project team, you'll be able to understand which individual is looking at which part of the problem. So following on from issue trees, we use hypothesis-based problem solving to get an understanding of some of the issues that could be present due to the overarching issue. I'd like to stress upon the fact that hypothesis-based problem solving is not an alternative, but should be used in conjunction with an issue tree. A hypothesis itself is an educated guess to a problem based on the available information. If you were to solve a puzzle, you would look at the whole puzzle, find possible parts, and quickly roll out those parts which don't seem likely or feasible. So hypothesis-based problem solving takes a broad view of the situation, making logical assumptions for potential causes based on the available data, and quickly rolling out the options which don't relate to the problem. You should end up with a few potential areas to investigate with, which you can acquire more data, tests, and revise the hypothesis until it leads to the ultimate solution. Now let's look at an example that we've outlined below. So let's say that Mr. Nguyen has a business in which the profit has been declining for the last 3 years. He's hired you to find out how we can solve this problem. So if we would apply the hypothesis-based problem-solving approach in this example, we know that profit is made up of revenues and expenses. Revenues can be broken down into volume and price, and expenses can be broken down into fixed and variable costs. Let's say after looking at the numbers, we discover that expenses are at the same level as they have been over the last 5 years. This clearly indicates that the problem lies within revenue. So let's say the business sells toys. If sales have gone down, it could be due to either a change in volume or the change in price of those toys. If we also find out that the prices have remained constant for the last 5 years, this could be due to a decline in volume. This could mean that the company's market share has decreased, or the market size itself has decreased. So from this quick analysis, you can understand which specific areas need to be targeted for further analysis and research.
So it's great that you've touched on issue trees and how you can use them to break down the problem, as well as hypothesis-based problem solving. Yep. I'm wondering, once you have those sub-issues using that issue tree, how do you actually go about solving those problems that you found?
Yeah, for sure. So this is in relation to our second phase, which is investigating the constituent components of the overarching problem to find data-driven insights. It's important to utilize a variety of sources and methods for research, and we've outlined a few that we think are quite pertinent to projects, particularly the ones that we've done at Impetus. So for example, a project may require for teams to get a better understanding of current market conditions so that the client can provide their services more proficiently, and thus would require thorough market research, which can include surveying or interviewing. Those results would be valuable pieces of data for analysis. Another project may necessitate teams to weigh up the costs for implementing a strategy, and additionally, understanding the risks that may be involved during the implementation, which would require the development of a risk mitigation plan. Teams would therefore need to use the appropriate frameworks to be able to develop highly pertinent solutions.
Yep, so after that, are there any other phases or steps to take?
Yeah, so we move on to our third phase, which is creating. And we look to create a narrative to be able to provide the findings that we've researched and analysed over the last couple of phases. Our teams are encouraged to carefully create this narrative so the client gets a better understanding of why the solutions are relevant and the value they provide to the organisation in fixing the specific issues.
Right, that makes sense. So what about the final phase? What do you need to do in that final phase?
Yeah, so this final phase is presenting, and this is arguably one of the most important parts of a project itself. We want to basically present to our client the findings that we've worked really hard over the semester to the client, whether it's through a presentation, PowerPoint presentation, or a report itself. We'll go through some great tips for creating some effective slide decks. Firstly, the team should work collaboratively to develop a defined structure of the entire slide deck. This should be clear and easy to understand. Approaches could vary depending on your client and whether they prefer to see solutions in the beginning or at the end. The slide should also indicate how the solution will assist the organization, but also what does it mean past that? In other words, what will the solution achieve for the organization? This is what clients are after, and it's super important to include this in each of the slides. Lastly, we encourage the teams to take the clients on a journey to understand how the problem has been delved and broken down.
Yeah. So do you have any final tips or specific tips for the presentation itself when you present to the client or you present to whoever it is?
Yeah, definitely. So we've broken it down into two sections. How we've broken it down is into the slides themselves and also just general effective presentation tips in terms of your body language. Yeah. There are a few, like we mentioned, and it's essential in terms of the slides that we create one message per slide. So this allows for the audience to understand exactly what they should be focusing on and what that slide looks into. This will help provide a clear structure for the entire presentations. We encourage our consultants to keep it simple within the slides in terms of using simple diagrams and graphs, which aren't difficult to understand. This also includes keeping the explanation fairly simple without too much jargon, which may confuse and bore the audience as well. It's also important to make sure you're conscious of your body language, which will help to deliver your message in a more clear manner and will ensure to help keep your audience engaged. Finally, it's imperative that you practice thoroughly because it's really evident when teams do not practice their presentations well enough, and that shows a lot more authenticity and confidence when presenting to the client.
Amazing. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sai. I've learnt a lot, and I think our viewers would benefit a lot from knowing about the process of consulting, what it's like to be at Impetus, and the technical frameworks used in consulting.
Yeah.
So I guess my last question to you is, if someone wants to get involved in Impetus, what can they do?
Yeah, so glad that you mentioned that, Jimmy. Our recruitment is open at the moment for our project consultant roles. It's a great opportunity for anyone who's interested in consulting and also building your professional networks in an engaging environment. And that's also really fun, filled with really great like-minded individuals. You'll need to submit your resume and answer a few questions to showcase your interest in consulting, but also your passion for social impact. And that's a really important part of our culture at Impetus. And for those who just watched this episode and are keen on applying or have already applied, please fill in the feedback form, which will indicate to us that you have a genuine interest in consulting. And that's a really important factor for us in the application phase itself.
Yeah, so thank you for being with us today, Sai.
Thanks for having me,
and
Jimmy.
we'll see you next time.
Thank you. See ya.
MASA would like to thank Sai from Impetus Consulting Group for joining us today. Just a reminder that applications do close at the end of May, so you might want to get in as quick as you can. In our collaboration today, Impetus have actually offered to go through a market sizing question and a few tips on how to complete a case study for the assessment center. So what are market sizing questions? Well, they're essentially estimating the size of a market using the issue trees that Sai touched on earlier. And the market sizing question for today's demonstration is, estimate the amount of government spending on public hospitals in Victoria each year. So if you think that's daunting at first, Daniel, the Director of Consulting at Impetus, will be going through it today. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jimmy. So I'm Daniel and I'm the Director of Consulting, and today I'll be taking you through a market sizing question. Now the market sizing question we're working through, as Jimmy mentioned, it's written up here on the board. It is public spending on hospitals in Victoria. Now I think in the time frame that we set for you, it's a bit unrealistic to ask you to cover everything, so we're going to provide some pretty clear parameters around that. These are the two major ones. The first one, we're only going to be looking at wages. We're not going to be looking at property or equipment or anything like that. And the second thing that we need to clarify is in terms of wages, we're only going to be looking at doctors, nurses, and surgeons. And that's just to narrow it down to make sure it's achievable in the time frame that we set for you. Now, in terms of actually solving the problem, after we've framed it, the first thing we want to do is we want to start an issue tree, just to segment and divide the problem, as I mentioned, and then we can cut it into its component parts, things that we can try and solve. So when you think about this problem, the main two things that you want to consider are the amount of staff and the wages of staff. So if we know these two variables, that will go a long way to solving our problem. In terms of wages, what we really need to know is wages by type, because doctors, nurses, and surgeons, they're not all going to have the same wage. It's going to differ. In terms of amount of staff, we really need to know the amount of hospitals in Victoria, so we know how many staff in total. Then we need to know the amount of staff at each hospital. So an easy way to figure that out is think of how many patients that might have, and then go with a patient-staff ratio. And then we also need to take into account shift work, because at a hospital, it's not like a 9 to 5. There are more people that work at the hospital than is just working at that one point in time, because someone's always going to be staffing 24 hours, 7 days a week. All right, so now that we've done our issue tree, we can just go about solving the component parts of our problem. So if you recall from the issue tree, it's just here. There's three things we really want to get and solve. So the first is the amount of hospitals, then the staff at each hospital, then wage by type. So first we'll start with the amount of hospitals in Victoria. Now, when you're doing this, you really want to structure your thinking out with nice logic. The numbers are important, but the specific amounts that you come to aren't particularly important. It's also good to work with round numbers, because you'll be doing some calculations later on. So we really want to build a geographic dimension first to figure out the amount of hospitals. There's a myriad of ways you could go about doing that, but I really prefer geographic. So if we think about the amount of hospitals, we want to get a sense of how many postcodes there are in Victoria. So if you think about postcodes, they generally in Victoria run from 3,000 to 3,999. So there's 1,000 postcodes. I know there's some outside of that, but there's not really too many. So if you think there's 1,000 postcodes in Victoria, then we think, okay, there might be one hospital for every 10 postcodes. Now that's just a guess based off general knowledge. And then if we do that calculation, then we get to 100 hospitals in Victoria. Now you've got to remember the parameters of the question. So we're not looking at total hospitals, we're just looking at public spending, so public hospitals. So if I estimate the market share of the public sector is 60%, that gives us a final amount of 60 hospitals in Victoria. Alright, so now we want to tackle the second part of our problem, which we discussed on the issue tree. We want to look at the staff at each hospital. So if we look at the staff at each hospital, we want to break it up similar to how we broke it up down there. We want to look at how many patients, and we also want to look at the patient-staff ratio. And the last thing we want to consider is shift work. So if we think about the amount of patients, we start with the population parameter again. We want to estimate the population of Victoria. Now, this is where it's really important to consider being directionally correct and precise. So I'm guessing it's around 6 million. Now, if you say something in the ballpark of there, 5, 6, 7, 8, that's generally okay. If you're out by a factor of 10, 20, something like that, then that's something that we'll look at. Okay, so if we say 6 million, then we want to get the total population coming to public sector. So we multiply it by 0.6, that gives us 3.6 million. So now that we have 3.6 million, we would now want to narrow it down to how many each hospital would have to cover. So 3.6 million, we divide it by 60, gives us 60,000. So this is the amount of people that could potentially go to one hospital. Now we want to think how many are going at one particular point in time. So if we then take that number of 60,000 and we say, okay, how many could potentially be sick at one point in time? At the moment, we'll just guess and we'll go with 1%. So we say 1% are sick at one point in time, and that gives us 600 patients per hospital that would go there at one particular point in time. So now we want to consider a patient-staff ratio for our different types of employees at the hospital. So if you remember, we got nurses, doctors, and surgeons. We're dealing with a pool of 600 patients. Just using your general knowledge, you can have a few guesses. So you think about the ratio of patients to nurses, it's probably around 1 to 4. That gives us 150 nurses. The ratio of doctors, it's a bit bigger. There's normally a couple of nurses for every doctor. So we'll put that ratio at 1 to 10. That gives us 60 doctors. Then we're looking at surgeons as well. There's normally a couple of doctors for every surgeon. So we'll give that a 1 to 30 ratio for patients. And that gives us 20 surgeons. So now we're looking at 230 staff. Now, for the ease of calculations, we're going to round that up to 250. It's important to remember that when you round up, remember which way you're rounding up, because you want to factor that in at the end. So we're rounding up here. If we round it down, we want to record that information as well. So now we want to look at shift work. That's something we want to consider. So if you think about, they're normally 8-hour shifts. There's 24 hours in a day. So it's normally an AM shift, a PM shift, and then probably a night shift. So it's 3 shifts. And then you also have to think about nurses aren't going to work every day. So they're normally going to work 4 or 5 days out of the week. So there's probably a nurse that's at home one of those days when there's 3 nurses working. So using this shift work, we'll probably multiply our total number by 4. So that will give us 1,000 staff members in total. All right, so now we want to go about solving the third and last component, and then we'll do some calcs at the end. So we really want to look at now wages of staff. We want to look at wages by type. And the number we really want to come to is a weighted average salary for one particular hospital. So if we look at wages by type, we have our 3 types here of employees. We've got nurses, doctors, and surgeons. In terms of a nurse, you want to think about how much they get paid. It's around about average. Average salary in Australia is sort of generally around 75k. So that's what we'll go with there. There's 150 nurses out of our workforce, which was rounded up to 250. So that gives us 60%. Remember, because it's gone from 230 to 250, we are going to have to bump those numbers up a bit. So nurses are now 65% of the workforce. Doctors are next. So we think about the doctors and nurse ratio. There's twice as many nurses as there are doctors, or a bit more than that. So the doctor's salary could expect to be about double. So we're working with 150k. There's 60 doctors out of a workforce of 250. So that's around 24%. And then we're going to have to bump that up again. So it becomes 25%, gives us a nice round number. And lastly, we have surgeons. So surgeons, you might think are paid maybe double of doctors because of the ratios, but then that 300k seems quite high for a surgeon, so we'll bring that down a bit, 250k. It's important to just do those checks as you go through and use your intuition. So surgeons, 250k, there's 20 surgeons out of a workforce of 250, so that's 8%, we bump that up now to 10%. So now we have our equation that we can calculate. So we've got 75k multiplied by 0.65, 150k multiplied by 0.25, 250 multiplied by 0.1, so it just represents the total amounts and the percentages. And so if we start working towards a weighted average, we do some small calcs in between our big calcs just to help us with the numbers. So 7.5 times 7.5 is 10%, so we times that by 6, then add the 0.5, so that gives us 48.75, and then here we're just going to round 48.75 up to 50 just to make calculations easier. Then we got 150 by 2.5, which is the same as 7.5 multiplied by 5, and that gives us 37.5. Similarly, we've got 250k by 0.1, which is the same as 12.5 by 2, so that gives us 25. We add all those up and we've got 112.5. And now if you recall, when we rounded up here, we rounded up doctors and surgeons proportionally a bit more than we rounded up nurses. So we're just going to bump that weighted average salary down to 110. That also helps with our ease of calculation. So now I've got our 3 numbers. We've got our weighted average salary. We've got 1,000, which is the amount of staff that are working at each hospital. And we've got 60, which is the amount of hospitals in Victoria. So now we can add it all up, do some multiplication, and come to our final answer. So if we multiply 110k by 1,000 by 60, we should get there. So 110k by 1,000, that gives us 110 million. We multiply that by 60, that gives us 6.6 billion. Now remember that we rounded up staff here from 230 to 250, and that represented a roundup of about 10%. So we're going to factor that in and take about 10% off that, which gives us 6 billion in total, and that's the final answer that we'll. Alright, and then lastly, as well as a market sizing question, at the assessment centre you will be asked to do a group case study. While it's difficult to simulate a group case study virtually, I thought I'd just give you a few quick tips. So I've just got 3 here. The first one is work collaboratively, so make sure you're bringing in your teammates and you're feeding off each other's points. The second one, you want to be signposting your key points, so make sure you're all on the same page, writing those down, so when you present, you know what your key points are to run through. And then lastly, time management. It's really, really easy when you're in a discussion to get caught up and go over time, so make sure you use your time really, really well, especially saving up some time at the end to present.
Hey everyone, my name is Eileen and I'm the Secretary for MASA this year, and I'm going to be expanding a bit on consulting case competitions, which are a great way to get a taste of what consulting is like within a short time frame. So there are many that run throughout the year, and any students from any year level or degree type can participate, which is the great thing about consulting. It really does not matter what background you're from, you can still have a crack at it and see if you like it or not. So case comps are all about developing and testing your analytical and problem-solving skills within a short time frame. Case comps will usually take place over the course of a week and will usually follow the timeline seen on the screen. On the day the case is released, you'll be given a brief with information about the client you'll be advising, sometimes a real client, sometimes hypothetical. Working in teams of usually 3 to 4, you'll advise a client on certain issues their business is facing and recommending solutions to resolve these issues. To achieve this, you'll engage in a range of different analytical tasks, such as conducting research on the market and the client's competitors, coming up with ideas, undertaking a SWOT analysis, estimating costs and projected revenue, and more. By the end of the week, you will submit a deliverable, usually in the form of a PowerPoint presentation, also known as a slide deck. After submitting the slide deck, you might have the opportunity to present to a panel of judges. A lot of the times, you'll be judged by the actual client themselves, as well as real consultants working in the field. You'll also engage in a question and answer afterwards, where the judges will ask further questions about your presentation. All in all, case competitions are a great way to develop your research, analytical, teamwork, and presentation skills, and the list goes on. Now, let's look at 2 examples of actual work you'll be doing when working on a consulting case competition. Firstly, a very big part of consulting case competitions is developing a recommendation. You will often delve more deeply into the questions or issues raised in the brief and do a lot of research. This will then ultimately inform your recommendations. So let's apply this process to a real example. The hypothetical client we'll use as an example is a not-for-profit who provides loans at a very low interest rate for the purpose of helping those from low socioeconomic backgrounds start their own micro-businesses. One of the questions stated in the brief is how the not-for-profit could tailor their services to young Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander peoples. When understanding the question and forming recommendations, it's important to look into data from reputable sources, such as the government, competitors, and studies conducted. In the hypothetical case, research might involve gathering census data about Indigenous students, schools with predominantly Indigenous students, and the typical student curriculum offered at these schools, as well as current practices. For example, research shows that Indigenous students have lower financial education levels than non-Indigenous students. Using this research, a recommendation can be developed to address this issue, such as implementing financial education in predominantly Indigenous high schools. Here, current education models were researched, and a free government program called Knowing, Growing, Showing, specifically targeting Indigenous students, was found. This then forms the basis of how the recommended financial education program can run. The slide seen reflects this progression of thinking. The left highlights the issue we're focusing on, low financial literacy amongst Indigenous students, which we found in our research, and the right is a recommendation, implementing financial education at Indigenous schools. These then act as a springboard for discussion about how this ties into the not-for-profit client. After increasing financial literacy amongst Indigenous students, they may then be empowered to start their own businesses. In these cases, the not-for-profit client can then provide them support through their loans. So that's one example of research and analysis you might conduct during a case competition. Your recommendation will also need to be feasible and realistic. These are some of the questions you will need to identify and answer throughout your slide deck. For our second example, we'll discuss how to estimate costs in a case comp. Let's say we're calculating the cost of labour in implementing a recommendation. Where we can, we'll use real statistics such as the average salaries of the workers involved. Where we can't find statistics, we can use anecdotal evidence or guesstimates. Although the estimation of costs may seem a bit confusing, it's just a matter of finding some statistics you can work with through your research, adding the costs together and estimating here and there. So long as your calculations can be justified, then this will be okay. Costs can be tracked through an Excel spreadsheet, which is the example here. This can be added to the appendix slide to show you've done your calculations. On an actual slide, you might want to present your cost breakdown in a simple graph so as not to confuse the judges. Here, the key costs of the recommendation have been stated and a simple graph visualises these costs. So those are just 2 examples of different things you'll work on when doing a consulting case competition. performing well also means exclusive networking opportunities with consulting professionals, as well as different prizes such as cash or a fast-tracked job application. Some case comps you'll also be flown out to other states or countries for free, and they're also a great CV boost. Regardless of whether you're interested in consulting or not, consulting case comps are a great way to develop yourself personally and professionally. You'll develop a range of analytical skills as well as important soft skills such as teamwork and presentation skills and working under time pressure. So I would highly recommend you to take on a consulting case competition regardless of what you're studying, as there's a lot of value you can get out of them.
I really agree with what Eileen had to say about case competitions. I mean, my very first case competition was Impetus Academy, which is a case comp run by Impetus Consulting Group, and it was essentially my introduction to the consulting world. I just want to give a huge thank you to all our special guests today, as well as our viewers for joining us. We hope that today's episode has helped you get a better understanding of what consulting entails. Just a reminder that if you plan on applying for Impetus, or if you've already applied, to fill in the feedback form tonight, your name will be highlighted in the application process as you've shown interest and motivation in consulting. Don't forget to follow us and Impetus on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and on Instagram, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.